As some of you know, this year's Fisher Center theme is What's in a Name, or how do we talk about things? And we've decided to begin this year's talk series with a discussion of the COVID pandemic, a topic that has been at the front and center of our lives since March. So how do we talk about this crisis? What becomes visible and important? Or what is left outside of the frame? The pandemic makes us talk differently about ourselves, about others, about politics, about capitalism, about other countries, about our leaders. In a large outbreak, people experience themselves not as individuals, but as a population. Sometimes for the first time, they have this experience of themselves as a population. The sudden loss of communal ties makes visible in a spectral form the inescapable presence of the community in our lives. The pandemic materializes sociality and interdependence on the global scale, while at the same time amplifying our anxieties about about those who are different from us, who don't share our opinion about wearing masks, for instance. And now let me introduce our speaker, Priscilla Wald. Professor Wald is a Florence Brinkley Professor of English and a Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She is the author of the book called Contagious: Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative, published with Duke University Press. She's also the author of another book, Constituting Americans: Cultural Anxiety in Narrative Form, also from Duke. She's currently at work on a monograph entitled Human Being After Genocide. Her work, as you can see, puts her in a position to speak to us about the current crisis and the anxieties it produces as it rages through the nation. I just wanted to give you kind of like a couple of quotes from the book. In her book, which I've been reading this week with great pleasure. In her book, Professor Wald talks about outbreak narratives and their social, scientific, and medical consequences. Outbreak narratives, she shows, inhabit the milieu between the authority of myth and the authority of science. And they gain their potency from this proximity to both. There is something ancient, in other words, in how we talk about disease. The carrier, Wald writes, both suffers and represents the sins of the modern world, end of quote. Outbreaks can be seen as punishment for, quote, venturing into primordial places we should not disturb, end of quote. In her book, Professor Wald talks about the inescapable proximity of the contagious and the sacred, of the apocalyptic collapse and the renewal and redemption of social bonds. So let me ask you to join me in the silent welcome of Professor Wald.
Thank you very much for that very generous welcome. So I'm going to go to a PowerPoint and share my screen, except that the PowerPoint is not appearing. Hang on one second. Okay. Sorry, let me try again. I'm the co-host, right? Ah, there it is. Excellent. Okay. So 25 years ago, when I began to work on this topic, I really didn't expect to be living my work. And nor did I in 2008 when I published my book. And that's surprising. I should have been prepared for this. I read all the warnings. I believed them, or I thought I did. I even had dinner. I was part of a group of colleagues working in global health, and we were working on a project, and I had dinner with this group, and one of the epidemiologists in this group was working as part of the national response team, pandemic response. And we were discussing it, and he said, the minute you see more than, or at least he said about himself, the minute I see more than a handful of cases of avian flu, The minute I start seeing that spreading, I am taking my family to our house in the wilderness of the North Carolina mountains and staying there until it's over. And I said, you're kidding, right? I mean, that was very apocalyptic. And he said, no, I am not kidding. So it's really curious to me that the first reports of the coronavirus, first in China and then coming to the US, that I somehow nonetheless did not see this coming. And I start with that because I coined the term outbreak narrative. I defined the phenomenon of the outbreak narrative. I've studied this for decades, and yet clearly I was caught up in it. So this is a very powerful story. And I'm going to talk about the story tonight, tell you what it is, why it's relevant to COVID, and how we might begin to tell this story differently. And I'm going to open with this preview from the film Contagion from 2011 that many of you people have been watching of late. So this is the preview, but it really gives you a sense of what this is about.
It's a groundbreaking ceremony for a new factory.
Did she mention seeing anyone who was sick? Anyone on a plane, the airport?
No, she said she was jet lagged.
The average person touches their face 3 to 5 times every waking minute. In between, we're touching doorknobs, water fountains, and each other.
Dad. No, go up to your room, honey. So we have a virus, no treatment protocol, and no vaccine at this time.
You had a seizure this morning, Beth.
She had a history of seizures, allergies.
Last night there were 32 cases.
Unfortunately, she did die.
Right. I see. Can I go talk to her?
Mr. Ramos, your wife is dead.
What are you talking about? What happened to her? What happened to her? Is there any way someone could weaponize the bird flu? Is that what we're looking at? Someone doesn't have to weaponize the bird flu. The birds are doing that.
Watch this. It's transmission, so we just need to know which direction.
On day one, there were 2 people, and then 4, and then 16. In 3 months, it's 1 billion. That's where we're headed.
They're calling out the National Guard. They're moving the president underground. People will panic. It will tip over.
The truth is being kept from the world.
Cook your samples, destroy everything.
Hello. I need you to get me the names of everyone who serviced this room. It's an emergency.
You can't panic now.
I know.
I'm going to get you home. I got people too, Dr. Cheever. We all do.
Don't talk to anyone. Don't touch anyone. Stay away from other people.
The president's out. We're not sick.
It's figuring us out faster than we're figuring it out.
It's mutating.
I think that's a good place to stop. So the question I asked is the question that motivated my book is, why is this story so appealing? This is one example of it, and it happened to come out 2 days, I think not accidentally, 2 days before the 10th anniversary of 9/11. But it's a story we tell over and over again. We're fascinated by this story of outbreaks becoming pandemics and threatening the human species, and then ultimately being contained. And I think there are a number of reasons that this fascinates us. It is, first of all, a disaster narrative. And again, those are very popular. It's a detective story. It's a medical thriller. But I think there's also something very specific about the notion of a pandemic and about contagion. And that is, I think that this story crystallizes our anxieties about globalization and how it's impacting social relations. So as you could probably tell, Gwyneth Paltrow, Beth Emhoff, is a wife and mother, but she's also a high-power corporate executive, and she gets sent halfway around the world to an exotic place, Macau, where she brings back who knows what to destroy her family and seed a global pandemic. And my evidence that she's sort of unnecessarily criminalized is that on her way back, she has a layover in Chicago where she has a former boyfriend, and this happily married woman calls this this boyfriend and extends her layover, and they have a fling. He's a politician. It's very secretive. And there's really, it does not advance the plot. So why do they do it? There's something threatening about this high power corporate executive also being a wife and mother. And I do think that that's just one among the many anxieties about globalization, but I think it's a pretty typical one. But I also want to think about this almost mythic quality of of contagion and of what happens in a pandemic. This is a species-threatening event. The species might be annihilated, but ultimately they're redeemed. And there's something about this apocalypse and what gets revealed that I think of as mythic. So in what follows, I'm going to talk to you about these elements of the outbreak narrative, where it comes from. I'll define it. I'll talk a little about how I got there. And then I'll end with a discussion of how we might retell this story, or at least raising a few questions about that. So I've talked about contagion as having a mythic element or some kind of deep appeal. And you can see this even in the most mundane of places. This is a global health textbook called The Politics of Global Health Governance, subtitled United by Contagion. And it's really interesting how whenever there's talk of global health, you almost immediately start talking about contagion, even though there are lots of non-contagious diseases that are involved in global health, but nonetheless, this is sort of the defining feature. And this sentence is from the first paragraph of the book. We learn health is the ultimate unifying issue for humankind. The world is becoming an ever smaller place, and microbes that cause devastating diseases do not stop for border guards. This is really interesting, the idea that health, specifically contagion, is a unifying issue. Why? We're all in this together, but we're also constantly exposed to each other. The world is becoming a smaller place, and microbes are border crossers. The paragraph goes on, more and more, we are coming to understand that people with diseases located anywhere from down the street to the other side of the globe have important and varied impacts on our well-being. Health has become more than a medical issue. It is also a development issue, a commercial issue, a humanitarian issue, and a security issue. Don't need to tell us, we are living it. But I think of contagion, and I love these signs from my neighborhood that went up immediately in March. We are all in this together, and the Duke one, which I particularly like the irony of, we're in this together, keep your distance. But that's the point. I see contagion as an analog for what it means to be human. We are social beings, and that means we really need each other. We need to be in each other's presence. We need to be in contact with each other. But at the same time, being in contact with each other also exposes us to dangers from each other of every kind, not just disease, but disease is a perfect analog for that danger. So this is part of the appeal, I think, of contagion, is that it is so much, it is so fundamental to the idea of being human. So I have two starting points, or two reference points for this talk. And one of them is the Declaration of Alma-Ata, which came out of a conference held in Alma-Ata in the former Soviet Union in September of 1978. It was sponsored by the World Health Organization and UNICEF, and delegates from 134 nations and 67 UN organizations. It was a really important and I think interesting moment, and something I wish people knew more about. I wish there was more to know. I've done a lot of research, and there's not a lot of information about it out there, but yet, again, very important. It was inspired by programs in the Global South, such as the Barefoot Doctors program in China, where China, the government trained a lot of young people to go out into remote villages and ask the villagers what their fundamental healthcare needs, what did they see as the most important healthcare needs of the community, and they built medical structures, they stocked clinics, they trained local people to be medical professionals, and it was really a pretty remarkable program, and there were things like it throughout the Global South, and this is, again, what inspired this event, and it came out of the UN Human Rights definition of health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, that this was a fundamental human right. And the signatories of the Declaration promised to work for universal access to primary healthcare, healthcare delivered in your community, primary healthcare by the year 2000. Well, we in the United States know how far we are from that. And I will come back to this at the end of the talk, but I think it's a really important starting point for the story I'm hoping to tell. The story I am telling came out of a 1989 conference held in Washington, D.C. And it happened at the end of a decade when HIV had made its way around the globe. Now, in the 1970s, there was a lot of sanguinity about catastrophic communicable disease. And especially with the eradication of naturally occurring smallpox in the late 1970s, the idea was that communicable disease as a serious threat was not going to be, was really a thing of the past, certainly for the global north, and increasingly would be for the world. And doctors were telling or researchers were telling their students, don't go into this field, tropical disease or emerging infection. It's not where the prestige is going to be. It's really going to be a kind of ho-hum field. And the CDC, which emerged specifically to deal with communicable diseases, began to turn their attention to epidemics in things like drug addiction, obesity, teen suicide, things like that. But even during this sanguinity, in various remote locations, these things we call novel viruses, as the one we're experiencing now, began to pop up. Now, they popped up mostly in pretty remote villages. They were quickly contained, and they didn't really come significantly to the attention of the general population outside of the specific areas. But I'm talking about things like Ebola, Marburg, Bolivian hemorrhagic fever, these really catastrophic diseases with really profound mortality rates. But they didn't catch our attention until HIV, which in fact, as we know, broke out. So they got together at this conference and they said these are all part of a particular phenomenon, which they coined disease emergence. These are emerging infections. And these are things to which humanity had no herd immunity, again, like what we're seeing now. And they said, this is a consequence of globalization and development patterns. The population is growing and people are moving into areas they haven't inhabited before. And at the same time, the world is shrinking and we are more and more in contact with each other. One of the organizers of the conference, a man named Stephen Morse, talked about human beings as traffic engineers. And he said, we were doing a really bad job at engineering and we had to get better. But the real point of this was they wanted people to understand that this was not something that medical science or epidemiology or public health could solve. This problem had to be seen as social and geopolitical, as well as medical and scientific, and it had to be addressed by profound changes in the way that we were inhabiting the planet and circulating goods and people around the globe, and doing as I say, development patterns. So this was the story they were trying to tell. A lot came out of the story. The 2 volumes you see in the middle, out of the conference, the 2 volumes you see in the middle were specifically publications that came out of the conference. Laurie Garrett's The Coming Plague was a journalistic account of it and of the problem of disease emergence. Richard Preston's The Hot Zone, a more sensational version of a particular outbreak and threatened pandemic, and gradually it moved into popular fiction and film. And this was all happening in the mid-1990s. I had just finished my first book. I began to see this obsession, this cultural obsession, and I really wanted to know, as I said at the beginning, what is the appeal of this story? What is going on with this? And the way I do my work is I look at something that emanates from somewhere. It's not an actual beginning, but it's kind of a crystallization, such as the 1989 conference. And I look at the way that a particular visual vocabulary, set of images and plot lines, storylines, and even specific keywords come out of this and begin to circulate through the mainstream media into popular fiction and film and form a set of conventions and a recognizable narrative or story that gets told over and over again with, some changes here and there, but with a basic set of, again, vocabulary words, images, and storylines that become very familiar. And this is what I call the outbreak narrative. So I'm going to give you one more film clip. This is the first scene of the film Outbreak that put this idea, along with Richard Preston's Hot Zone, into widespread circulation. The word outbreak, suddenly everyone was using it after this film. And what you're going to see at the opening, there's going to be an epithet by Joshua Lederberg, who was the main organizer of the 1989 meeting. The single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on the planet is the virus. Really important point. And then you're going to see what's called an establishing shot. And don't worry, I won't talk through the whole thing. You're going to see an establishing shot where the camera begins with a bird's eye view and gradually moves into a place. And this is part of pathologizing this space, that something untoward is happening here, something dangerous, something we should be nervous about.
Men wounded and battered we can deal with. But this strange disease. 30 men dead yesterday. 18 the day before. We need supplies. Plasma, penicillin.
I'll get you everything you need, Doctor.
You Americans. Please, give me out of this shithole.
Hey, buddy, that's what we're here for. We're going to take you home. But first, we're going to take a little blood sample, all right?
I'm gonna die, right?
No, you're not going to die.
Tell my girl I love her.
You're not going to tell her. You're going to tell her yourself, all right?
Soldiers inside are in the early stages of the disease. By tomorrow night, they will look like this.
Oh, God. I'll authorize an immediate airdrop, Doctor. It's even worse than I thought. Get the plane here by 1900 hours. Well, shouldn't we leave the plane, do we?
So that's the opening of the Outbreak narrative, and of Outbreak, sorry. And it contains a lot of the key features of the Outbreak narrative. So it really puts this story out there. It's a very popular film. It suggests a geography of disease, and one of the things I note is that in the Outbreak narrative, almost invariably, pretty much invariably, the disease moves from the global south to the global north. And it stigmatizes people's behaviors and places in the meantime. Expertise moves in the other direction, from the global north to the global south. And I see this as a really interesting image of expertise, of representing that. And if you remember, the Zairean doctor is walking out and he says, those men are in the first stages of disease, and after, by tomorrow night, they will look like this. And he begins to move the tarp and we expect something horrific. The camera does a 180 and we see the image mediated through the visor of Donald Sutherland, who has entirely disappeared, right? So this is expertise, Global North expertise. We are meant to be seeing through his eyes. He's going to take care of it. He knows how to deal with this problem, and he's somehow transparent in the process, and our vision is mediated. And of course, what happens is in the present day of the film, which is 1995, this same disease strikes a Northern California town, and Donald Sutherland wants to nuke them as well. And there's a huge outcry, but these are American, he says they're casualties of war, which is what he says to Morgan Freeman about the mercenaries. And the response is, but these are Americans, sir. So one of the things that is another element of the outbreak narrative is who is expendable and who is not. It's about the recognition that we are a global network and the need for containment. And again, who can be sacrificed and who not. So I'm now going to move into talking about some of the key features. I'll do this pretty quickly about the outbreak narrative, and then, and as I said, conclude with a sense of how the story might be told differently. So I've mentioned that it has to be apocalyptic, and there's going to be no drama if it's a cold circulating around the world. I actually think that could be really interesting, but it's not going to get a big audience. It's about interdependence and the geography of disease. So in addition to this moving from the global north to the global south to the global north, is what you saw in that textbook. Like science, emerging viruses know no country. There are no barriers to prevent their migration across international boundaries or around the 24 time zones. We are all interconnected. And note Richard Preston in The Hot Zone, which is journalism, sensational journalism, not a novel. The number of times I hear people call it a novel, it reads like one. But note where he takes this: a hot virus in the rainforest lives within a 24-hour plane flight from every city on Earth. All of the Earth's cities are connected by a web of airline routes. The web is a network. Once the virus hits the net, it can shoot anywhere in a day: Paris, Tokyo, New York, LA, wherever planes fly. And I won't read the whole of the Laura Garrett quotation. It really summarizes the message of the 1989 conference. But I want to point out that she talks about Andromeda strain, Michael Crichton's 1969 novel, which was made into a film a couple years later, about a devastating disease that is seen, that they believe has come from outer space and destroyed all but, or quickly annihilated all but 2 members of a town in the southwestern US. And it's amazing how often scientists, when I was researching this book in the mid-90s and into the early 2000s, would use the Andromeda strain to talk about these catastrophic communicable diseases. And in the US, it was invariably Africa, used in relation to Africa. So even though hantavirus, there was a huge outbreak of hantavirus, one of these diseases, in 1994 in the US Southwest, same landscape as Michael Crichton's novel, nobody used, that I found, used the Andromeda strain to refer to it. So it's nearly surfaced in Africa in the form of Ebola virus, and Africa's a place creating niches from which virtually anything might arise. So this is the kind of stigmatization that I was talking about. One of the key metaphors, and one of the ones that most fascinates me, is the animation of the microbe. And particularly around the metaphor of microbial warfare. You've heard this with COVID. We are at war with the microbe or with the virus. And Joshua Lederberg talks about how difficult it is to accommodate to the reality that nature is far from benign. At least it has no special sentiment for the welfare of the human versus other species. The survival of the human species is not a preordained evolutionary program. And part of my reading on this is, we don't know how to deal with it if, as he says at the beginning of Outbreak, this thing that, or Dustin Hoffman says, it's so tiny and it's beating us. This thing that doesn't have agency, that is indifferent, it's not out to get us, but is the single biggest threat to man's, quote, man's domination on the planet. And so I think turning it into an enemy gives humanity a more dignity, that we're actually fighting a wise or smart foe. And it also is something that we know how to deal with. We know what war is. But metaphors, parts of speech, all of these things both reveal some biases that we have about the world that are unconscious, but also perpetuate those biases. And I just want you to look very quickly at Richard Krauss, the quotation also in red, and he was one of the people who attended the 1989 conference. And look at what, he's a scientist, look at what he says about microbes. They're not idle bystanders waiting for new opportunities offered by human mobility. They possess remarkable genetic versatility that enables them to develop new pathogenic vigor and escape population immunity. They are more than simple opportunists. They have also been great innovators. And then, of course, Richard Preston, picking this up, viruses are molecular sharks, emotive without a mind, compact, hard, logical, totally selfish. The virus is dedicated to making copies of itself, which it can do on occasion with radiant speed. The prime directive is to replicate. There are a couple of problems with this metaphor. One of them is how easy it is, once you've animated the microbe, to demonize the ostensible carriers, people who are living in the place where the disease is thought to emerge from. So we saw that with the coronavirus, how the anti-Asian and Asian American biases, people were being beaten up in the streets in the US and in Europe. But note, Barbara Culleton, a terrific, very responsible science journalism, look at the language of how easily this kind of thing can happen. Another unwelcome immigrant is Sol virus, a cousin of Asian Hantan virus, which causes hemorrhagic fever. In the contemporary moment, it's whoever is being demonized in a particular moment. At the moment, it's terrorists, that viruses, microbes are compared to terrorists, and of course, terrorists are typically pretty racialized. So that's one of the problems. Another problem, however, is the agency that's attributed to the microbe. And if you remember, the message of the 1989 conference was, we can't think of this as something science has to solve. We human beings are the traffic engineers. We're the people creating the conditions that allow for outbreaks and allow them to transform into pandemics. And seeing the microbe as an enemy and this notion of microbial warfare really takes that burden off human shoulders. We're seeing this as the microbe having ingenuity. We have to fight it like an enemy, rather than all of this is caused by us, human beings. Once the microbe is animated in this way, it's very easy to make it mystical, kind of otherworldly. And this is where the kind of mythic elements begin to emerge. Tom Geispert was a USAMRIID, the Army CDC scientist, and Preston writes about how when he's looking in an electron microscope at an Ebola microbe, he sees white cobras tangled among themselves like the hair of Medusa. They were the face of nature herself, the obscene goddess revealed naked. This life-form thing was breathtakingly beautiful. As he stared at it, he found himself being pulled out of the human world into a world where moral boundaries blur and finally dissolve completely. He was lost in wonder and admiration, even though he knew that he was the prey. And the next step from this is this otherworldly microbe becomes, in a sense, either an emblem of the earth itself incarnated, or an agent for the earth, or in some of the more fictional variants, an eco-terrorist that's using the microbe to avenge the earth and cleanse it of the human virus. Carl Johnson, another one of the attendees at the conference, talks about the earth as a progressively immunocompromised ecosystem. And again, Preston is such a great go-to. I do see these in other places, but he's such a perfect example. The biosphere may not like the idea of 5 billion humans, or perhaps the human species is just so much meat that cannot defend itself against a life form that might want to consume it. The Earth's immune system, so to speak, has recognized the presence of the human species and is starting to kick in. And then finally, once we have this animated mythic microbe, we get, and this is very clear in popular fiction and film, the most absurd of them, less realist ones. And I have to say, one of the things I love about popular fiction is that it can take something like a metaphor that, you know, if I said to a scientist, you know, an epidemiologist, you're always talking about microbial warfare. Do you realize what you're thinking? He would not be unfair to, it would not be unfair of him to say to me, you know, it's just a metaphor, it's a figure of speech. But what they do is they take things like metaphors or figures of speech and they get blown into full-blown scenarios, and you can really, it's like a magnifying glass, you can really see what the assumptions are and how these biases are circulating. So Chuck Hogan in Blood Artists has a virus that literally takes over a human body and becomes a hybrid virus human. They call him Patient Zero or Zero. And the novel is about the two CDC researchers who are trying to track him down. He's seeding epidemics or throughout the US, or I'm sorry, outbreaks throughout the US, again, to avenge the planet Earth. He had been an environmentalist before he got infected. And Marek is one of the researchers. So second quotation, the threat of a mutant virus gifted with human intellect and cunning posed hazards exceeding Marek's worst imaginings, but all he envisioned was its one great advantage. Epidemic control had never been simpler. Zero was like a tumor Marek could go in and surgically remove. And that's exactly, so you see how this narrative that evolved out of this 1989 conference ends up conveying exactly the opposite message that they were trying to convey. They were trying to say, don't rely on science and epidemiology. You really have to change your practices. This is a much bigger problem. You can't wait for the crisis. You have to address the problem beforehand. But these stories always end up, and this is part of their mythic appeal, being epidemiologists and scientists doing battle with these mutant microvirus hybrid things over the fate of humanity. And humanity is ultimately saved, and there's a kind of, you know, and this is again why I call it mythic, there's a kind of revelation and renewal that comes out of this. So a more sedate version in journalism that, again, people are more likely to encounter if they don't read the things I read. And this was from a May 2003 Newsweek special issue on the last SARS coronavirus. These images were on, the photos were on effacing pages, and they were linked by the caption that I've written above. Fear of SARS prompts a Lufthansa crew to wear masks in the Hong Kong airport. The virus may have been born on a farm like the one above in Guangzhou, China, where animals and people live close together. And then the text tells us the novel coronavirus that causes the syndrome emerged from Guangdong, the same Chinese province that delivers new flu viruses to the world most years. Pigs, ducks, chickens, and people live cheek by jowl on the district's primitive farms, exchanging flu and cold germs so rapidly that a single pig can easily incubate human and avian viruses simultaneously. The dual infections can generate hybrids that escape antibodies aimed at the originals, setting off a whole new chain of human infection. The clincher is that these farms sit just a few miles from Guangzhou, a teeming city that mixes people, animals, and microbes from the countryside with travelers from around the world. You could hardly design a better system for turning small outbreaks into big ones. So what is the story they're telling? The image on the right is an image of two temporalities: primitivism, a primitive group who, primitive culture that doesn't know better than to live cheek by jowl with its animals, juxtaposed with modernity, how rapidly, this is the image of the global south, how rapidly that gets into the nearby airport, and of course it's going to go out into that net that Preston talks about. And the article, so moving from the global south to the global north, it's a Lufthansa flight, right, going to Germany or thereabouts. It's a problem, a medical problem, and it gets solved. Expertise goes from the global north to the global south. The article is all about how North American and European researchers worked with Chinese researchers, but the credit really goes to the technology in the global north. And ultimately, then, this is a medical problem that gets solved by medical science. So again, this is exactly not the story that the conference organizers wanted to tell. So what's actually happening here? This is not an image of primitivism where people don't know better than to live cheek by jowl with their animals. This is an image of poverty. And, you know, poverty does not emanate in the global south. It's the effect of a global, of globalization, well, a lot of things, but it's a globalization issue, the economic inequities that are growing increasingly as we globalize more and more. It is the solution is not in medical science, but it's to change our development and globalization practices and to think differently about the economic inequities, because there is no single, well, for a lot of reasons, first and foremost because there are inequities, but also in terms of a pandemic, there is no single vector that more readily turns an outbreak into a pandemic than poverty, than a population living close together with inadequate healthcare, no access to state-of-the-art healthcare or very little, you know, insufficient food, clothing, clean air, clean water, etc. Those are the conditions that not only promote outbreaks, but that quickly turn them into pandemics. Rapid spread, mutations, making it more difficult to track the problem and, of course, create a vaccine. So in September of 2008, Margaret Chan, who was the head of the World Health Organization, this is the 30th anniversary of Alma-Ata, made the theme for the year, Return to Alma-Ata. And she said, what, you know, that whole idea in Alma-Ata was actually a great idea. First of all, global poverty is an equity issue. We should not have so much of the world's population living in poverty and so much variance, so much discrepancy between the wealthy and most of the world, the 1%. The 1% versus the 99. And she said, first and foremost, it's a health equity issue, but it's also a health issue for the reason I just said about poverty as a vector. And she said, and frankly, it's economically wise. It makes more sense. And my figures are not recent. And in fact, the coronavirus, I think, is turning out to cost a lot more even than was predicted 2 years ago in the World Bank projections. But at that time, in 2018, the World Bank projected that a pandemic like the one we're living with would cost more than $3 trillion US. And if you look down, the permanent infrastructural changes would be less than 1% of the cost of the response, or less than $1 US per person. In other words, a pandemic like this one would be far more costly than what it would cost to make the kinds of infrastructural changes that would meet the goals of Alma-Ata, universal access to primary health care. So why aren't we doing it? And as I said, these predictions have been around for a while. Why aren't we doing it? Many, many, many reasons, far too many to go into now. However, I think the outbreak narrative contributes. So the question I want to ask then is, how will we tell the story of COVID-19? And the story contributes because it affects the way we think about the problem. It therefore affects the way we generally deal with the problem. As I said earlier today, a story is in effect a technology, and technologies help us see some things more clearly, and they obscure other things in the process. So the outbreak narrative actually emerges because epidemiologists are seeing this problem happen over and over again, and this way, it's precedent. When it happens, they have a sense of where the problem might be, of how they might respond, and all those are good things. However, as I've been showing you, not only does it have a stigmatizing effect, which is problematic, but it also obscures other possibilities for where the problem might have come from at any given time, which is what happened in the 2014 Ebola outbreak. And finally, it is a story of crisis and survival. And so it tells us that, that we are it's a story that asks us basically to wait until the outbreak or the pandemic has happened. And then what are the tools at our disposal? Vaccines, pharmaceutical, quarantine, all really important. But what it isn't telling us is how to think about changing our practices, as the 1989 conference requested, as the Alma-Ata conference requested, to change our practices so that we can anticipate and either prevent outbreaks or prevent them from becoming pandemics. So what story will we tell of COVID-19? Do we want to tell a story about medical science versus enemy microbes doing mythic battle for the fate of humanity, or human beings acknowledging social responsibility for the world in which we all live together? In other words, do we want to tell this crisis and survival story over and over again, or do we want to begin to tell COVID-19 as an indication of where we've gone wrong, and to ask instead how we want to live more responsibly and equitably in a global world? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wald. I would like to open the floor. We have a few minutes for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please put your name, type your name into the chat box, and I will call on you and unmute you.
Or a comment. I'm very thick-skinned and I'm always happy to learn where I'm going wrong. So please challenge away.
While everybody is thinking, I wanted to ask you a question about China in the current outbreak. It was really interesting. I sort of read news in a couple different languages, and it's interesting to compare how the pandemic is being covered. And one of the virus originated in China. So like there's some elements that were just as you described, but then China, the Chinese suppressed the outbreak really quickly and really effectively. And there was really no room in the American media to acknowledge that victory as the strength of the political system, of the social system, of the cultural approach, and so forth. There was just critique and dismissal of the Chinese model, and sort of anti-communism kind of was the background of that. So, and it was really disappointing to see. So I was wondering whether that victory kind of produced a break in this narrative, in the familiar narrative, where the expertise always comes from the global north.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, the expertise doesn't, my argument is that in the story, the expertise always comes from the global north. But in fact, that's not the case. And with the last SARS coronavirus, the whole, China did a lot of the work, and Singapore and other places did a lot of the work to figure out what the problem was and develop treatments and so on, just like now. And so I think if we acknowledge that, that would be a break in the story. But I don't see, and by we there, I mean, the US government, even the media, where, I watch MSNBC and they're trying to show all these other countries that have dealt with it so much better than the US, but everybody's still holding out hope for the vaccine coming from the global north. When Russia says it has a vaccine, we frankly, rightfully doubt that it has happened that fast and that it's safe and whatever. But China's been working on this for a long time, and they were working on generic coronavirus vaccines. And I think it's just as likely, and probably, I'm going to guess more likely, that a successful vaccine is going to come out of a Chinese lab, the first successful vaccine. Certainly, and there's a lot of cooperation going on. So that's a story I hear, but it's not a story that gets taken up in popular culture and whatever. Now, with the coronavirus, COVID, one of the questions I'm asking is, I'm really going to be interested to see what narrative emerges. And I am hopeful that the narrative is not going to be the classic outbreak narrative because, for instance, of the Black Lives Matter protests and their analysis and how prominent that the critique I've been looking for has been in this pandemic, including being picked up by the media. We were talking earlier about the fact that the media is using the phrase white supremacy to mean white superiority for the first time I've ever seen, just regularly. So, so I think we really might be writing a different narrative this time, and I hope so. And I see that somebody asked, "Who is we?" Should I answer? Can I answer that question?
Absolutely.
Who is the we? I'm afraid I won't constantly being able to keep track, but I saw that one flash across, and that's a great question. The we, well, I've talked about probably different we's, but the we that I am mostly talking about is a kind of global north we. The we in the outbreak narrative is the US and Western Europe. And there is always in any crisis an us against them, and that's the one that I consistently see coming out. If I didn't answer the question about the we you were asking about, please speak up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions, 3 people on stack here in the chat. So I'm now allowing you folks to unmute yourselves. So Conrad, if you could unmute yourself and maybe turn your camera on if you have a camera. If not, just click unmute and you should be able to speak.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, my camera is not working at the moment. But I found it very interesting when you brought up the fact that I believe I wrote it down actually. I think you said there's like a mythical aspect to the pandemics and everything. Mm-hmm. I found that very interesting because it may seem like it's kind of like a fear, conspiracy, but do you think it's like a coincidence that like there are a lot of movies like Contagious, I believe that's what it's called, or Outbreak? Do you think it's like a coincidence that the media in itself is very fond of the idea of making like movies or just any type of media about a pandemic outbreak? Do you think it's kind of like a coincidence that so many of these types of movies have been made and now we're in that situation?
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence in the sense that this was a predictable thing. And disaster narratives are typically about, some of them are extreme, like the asteroid or the aliens, but if you think about films about fires, tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, pandemics, we have as a culture a fascination with, I would say maybe humans do. I don't ever like to make anything, innate, but disaster narratives are very popular across cultures. And the question is always why. And there's something, going back to the Greeks, there's something cathartic. This is an anxiety we have. We see it played out on the screen. There's something cathartic about having our personal anxieties expressed, but also there's resolution. And one of the things that typically comes out of a disaster narrative is, particularly if it's a thing affecting not just a small group in a high rise, but a whole culture, what comes out of it is a sense of rejuvenation and renewal. And that's what I see in these narratives, that there is an apocalyptic threat. It's contained, so we're reassured that we don't really have to change anything. Science and technology and epidemiology have us covered, but also then there's a kind of renewal. We get a second chance. We get a chance to think about what went wrong and make positive changes, and it reaffirms the superiority of humanity, or the staying power of humanity, against that quotation from Letterberg about how the virus is a threat to our dominance on the planet. We prevail. Mm-hmm. So that's why I see that.
Seeing that we've had the discussion, the topic of a pandemic has been mentioned before, I would have hoped that this pandemic would have been taken care of a little quicker, but
Definitely. And why didn't we listen?
Yeah.
We don't want to make those changes. Why aren't we listening about climate change? Climate change comes as close to an outbreak narrative as any other disaster. And why aren't we listening? I mean, really, why aren't we listening? And that we is we as a culture, Global North, US.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you so much, Conrad and Professor Wald. So we have Tanner. Tanner, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Professor, for providing your insight this evening. It's been really insightful. I want to ask you, do you think COVID-19, the pandemic that we're in, will increase acceptance for the idea of universal health care or other similar policy initiatives here in the US? And how would that help us to view the idea of an outbreak narrative for the better?
I hope so. I think it depends on what happens in November, but I really hope so. I hear far more talk and talk about it and more. It's a more favorable thing than it was even in the last election cycle, and it was then too. So I do think there's an increasing demand for it, especially as healthcare prices go through the roof and more people don't have access to it at all. So I do think this has scared people and more people want it. So we'll see. What it would change is I mean, by itself, it's not going to make a huge difference, but what it indicates is a move towards thinking about issues of equity. And I am heartened because I do see people in this Black Lives Matter analysis is evidence of this. I see more and more people having the analysis that structural racism is not only made visible by the pandemic because populations are disproportionately affected, morbidity and mortality, but also that that structural racism is at the heart, and structural violence, these inequities, these global inequities, are at the heart of the problem that is producing these conditions, right? Globalization, which is also exacerbating it. So they're fueling it, and globalization is exacerbating it. But all of the racial capitalism, right? All of these problems, inadequate healthcare, inadequate education, what we finance and what we don't finance as a culture in the US, all of those things are indications of racial capitalism, and I would say propelled by them.
Thank you so much. It's sad that all these things have had to happen, a pandemic and other similar events, for us to finally have these conversations, but thank you for your insight.
Thanks.
Excellent questions, you folks. All right, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Jeff, you can unmute yourself.
Hey, yeah, thank you. So I just had a question regarding, well, obviously this whole presentation is about kind of, well, as you described, outbreak narrative. And so surrounding the coronavirus, we seem to have two different polarized narratives that kind of come to be from mostly, like they seem to stem from which political ideology you seem to align with. So I was wondering, you said that the idea of the conference in Russia, I believe, was to kind of shift the way we think about our relationship with the world and our individual responsibility. But that message was shifted to be more like, I don't know, it seems like to be more romanticized in a sense where humans are kind of fighting the virus itself, making it like we're the players and then the virus is another player. And so my question is, if that were the narrative, it seems like that kind of narrative would kind of promote individual action against the virus. But obviously we're seeing a lot of people who are questioning the like reality of the virus, people who don't believe in masks. So I was just wondering how you thought that that kind of like denial or I don't know, dissent from kind of helping or fighting the virus kind of plays in with, I don't know, I guess the narrative.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what is going on right now, one thing that's really different from the standard outbreak narrative is we're not, I mean, the we here has to be really split up, right? So on the one hand, there are people who are relying on the scientists, right? So right now, and I don't know what, that's why I say I don't know what the narrative that's going to come out of COVID is going to be, but I see three narratives that are contradictory but also overlapping. And one of them is the Black Lives Matter analysis, that we do have to think about this in broader terms, that we have to bring social justice questions to the fore, and they are primary and will help us deal with these problems like climate change and you know, how we inhabit the planet and pandemics. That's one. That's mine. I'm in there. There is the we can rely on science to solve this. Now, we are in the middle of a crisis. So yeah, I'm waiting for that vaccine when Dr. Fauci approves it. So that, you know, I am looking to science at this moment to help us get over this particular crisis so that we can move on and make the changes we need to make. So there's the reliance on science, but not, there are probably some people who think, oh, we'll just leave it to science and go back to normal, right? It's the go back to normal people who are thinking science will solve this. And then there's the third group, which is it's all a hoax and science is a hoax. They don't even believe in science. They're just, this is where the weird politics of this moment have come in. I could not have imagined a president who actually fostered the epidemic. I mean, there might be presidents who are helpless against it or don't know what to do, whatever. But the idea of a president who knew about it, didn't warn people because of a campaign that was, I mean, it's just, you know, election. It's unimaginable to me what has happened. And that has thrown everything into a different light. And I have no idea how that's going to end up getting written. It will be interesting to see if we survive. We will.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, we have three more questions. Professor Darian McGee, who is an expert on China and the environment, has a question in the chat. Professor McGee, do you, if you're able to, do you want to speak? Do you want to ask your question?
Oh, that's what I mean. Sure, I know how what a pain it is to put things in the chat, so I can keep up with what's going on.
I was trying to read it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thanks for an interesting talk. And I told my students I was in Hong Kong when the 1997 bird flu happened. I was in China in 2004, right after, well, when they were still reeling from SARS, and so we need to take these things seriously. And I just, there's more two comments that sprang to mind when you mentioned how we, or that we as righteous narrative understand COVID in the rearview mirror. And two images sprang to mind was one of the, Italy hit very hard early on, but also the only EU member to sign on to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore very willing to economically embrace China in ways that the rest of Europe is skeptical about, sort of celebrating the arrival of Chinese medicines and nurses and doctors to help. Although the Italian media, to Ala's point, the Italian media kind of depended on which newspaper you looked at. We're saying, yeah, this is not nearly as much a boost as it's getting made out to be. This is more political stunt, right? And then the other one, the Chinese colleague sent me a picture of a sign in a wet market in Wuhan that said, "Be careful in here, you might catch the American virus." Official sign with a red stamp, right? The Sanitation Bureau. But
yeah.
And I think to further, I guess, in that narrative, how the story gets told. I mean, I think the Chinese government bears some serious responsibility and should be demonized for the way, or should be held accountable for the way they treated Dr. Liu Liang, right? Who who was the first to raise the alarm about this and then died of the virus after he was silenced by the Chinese government, right? I mean, this is just an authoritarian system reacting just the same way it did to SARS, where so that I think probably explains a lot of the poisoning of how people here in the West don't want to talk about the success that Al rightly points out the Chinese government did have, and control.
Well, I think too, I mean, there's also a difference between blaming a government or an individual in a government and blaming a population.
Absolutely.
Right. So that, I mean, I totally agree with you about Xi. And I think, everything you're saying is really right and interesting. And I love the American virus sign. Please send that to me. I love that. But I once found myself on the other side of an outbreak narrative when it was the H1N1. It was one of the one that was in the US, H1N1, was that it? Swine flu? Yeah. And I was going to Hong Kong, and we were all stopped and our temperature taken, and people staying away from America. Oh, you're from North America, or the US in particular. And I really had the sense, not that this was something they were really concerned about, but it was like, hey, you did this to us, and now here it is back. I really got that sense. And I was fascinated. And I thought, right on, fair enough. But it was an interesting position to be in with a disease that was not as bad as people thought. But thank you, those are really interesting. I would love that image.
All right, great. We have a couple more questions. Elizabeth Johnson, and then Professor Linda Robertson has a question. Elizabeth?
Yeah, everyone just froze. So I'm hoping that's not.
Okay,
great. I have a really broad question. First of all, thanks for a really lovely talk. That was incredibly thought-provoking. My broad question is animated by a number of things. I think in our earlier conversation, Olive, that we're like, this is the crisis of social reproduction, as well as being a crisis of enormous, connection to histories of settler colonialism and extraction and all of these things that you've kind of already laid out for us. And I guess in listening to you talk about the outbreak narrative, I'm really struck by the role of a certain kind of heroism that comes on the back of the outbreak narrative. And there seems to me to be a particularly gendered attachment to that. And I'm wondering, like what your thoughts are, how you've considered or written about the role of gender and tropes of masculinity associated with the outbreak narrative.
I haven't really. And I think you're right, although a lot of if you watch Contagion, for instance, no one comes out great. Very few come out great from that film, but the ones that do are actually women. So I would say, thinking about it, earlier on, the men are the scientists and the heroes and whatever. Increasingly, there's been a real effort to degender that and to have women occupy those roles. What's interesting is rarely, not never, but rarely are women the bad guys. This is usually a problem caused by corporations that tend to be masculine. I talked about how Beth Emhoff is demonized in Contagion and has that affair and whatever, but it's not her fault. She didn't do anything wrong. She wasn't deliberately spreading anything, and she didn't do anything wrong to contract this. So she's demonized kind of almost on the side in a way that I don't think was conscious. But I can only think of 2 or 3 of these novels where women are involved in like deliberately spreading them or have been the corporate deciders or whatever. So I don't have a good answer for that question, but I don't. It's not gendered in any easy way at this point, I would say. Now I could be wrong, but yeah. But if you have thoughts, please tell me.
I mean, I only have unformed thoughts, and one of these, like one of my thoughts is motivated by the fact that recently, sort of in my own, I do a lot of writing and teaching around the environmental humanities, and I think in the history of kind of environmental thought, it's been really fairly easy from the like early 20th century on to in some ways dismiss ecofeminism. Mm. And I think with the COVID crisis, there has been, like I've found myself kind of returning to some texts of Val Plumwood and, like rethinking and re-engaging with ecofeminism in a way that I haven't for a while. And I think there's, like I don't have any coherent thoughts about it, but I think there's something to it.
Yeah, I think that's fair in the sense that, the notion of competition, say the Darwin, life is struggle, life is competition, life is war, and that assumption, which again feeds a certain kind of corporate capitalism, et cetera, versus cooperation. And the ecological variant is cooperation, which I think people are starting to see, like not the war metaphor, the eco metaphor. And the way that, or what I might suggest there is all the sociological studies that talk about how women-owned businesses tend to foster cooperation more than competition. And they've been more successful as a result. And increasingly biologists, they said it at the time, of Darwin too, but it didn't really get picked up. But increasingly they're talking about cooperation as probably more than competition being a path to success in quote, success in evolution. So I do think that both biologically and sociologically, we are thinking more and more about cooperation, which does tend to get gendered. I don't think it has to get gendered, but it has traditionally, and again, the sociological studies about women-owned versus men-owned, male-owned businesses has suggested this. So there are a lot of studies about that. Just a thought, unformed for me too. Thank you, great question.
Great, wonderful. So we have Professor Linda Robertson on stack. I hope we can see her.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I wanted to extend the comments that were made earlier. I have some epistemological issues with using the word narrative to describe any possible way of thinking about the nature of the coronavirus, but that's an epistemological issue. I don't want to raise it now. But I do want to raise this question of narrative, of how are we going to write this narrative? The level of fragmentation just in the United States, but certainly in other countries where they're protesting, having to do something so horrifying as wear a mask, where we have people willing to believe that the best solution is to just let this thing run its course, points to me to a social fracture, and that it's the social fracture that constitutes our moment. And it is an extraordinary moment. And one of the tropes that is not mentioned, and I don't mean it as merely a rhetorical vessel, is the notion that you should just let people die out. You mentioned Darwin earlier. Clearly, I'm talking about social Darwinism, and I'm talking about how it manifested itself in the United States, where educating the poor, offering the poor medical care, was interfering with natural process. And therefore, there should not be any social programs. Just let them die. If they're strong enough, they'll survive. That's what made Horatio Alger such a popular writer for, not for the poor, but for the rising middle class that wanted to soothe its conscience about the levels of poverty in America during the Industrial Revolution. I'm right now reading Alex Ross's Wagnerism, and the extent to which Wagnerism became the dominant structure for much of our fiction and much of our entertainment is a story I think we ought to attend to. I think it has a lot to do with why we frame the way to solve an outbreak is to drop a nuclear bomb. Just wipe them out, for God's sakes. So I'm concerned when we talk about I'm concerned that what that we reinvokes is the notion that the person who has the power determines the narrative. Well, we're watching that come true right now, right in front of our eyes. So I think we need to think more about, there's a whole lot of groups out there competing right now, and how are they forming their thoughts? How are they arriving at their sense of what they can trust? You have told us how you arrived at your sense brilliantly, in a very enlightening way, extremely enlightening, the way that science wanted to talk about it being tipped on its head because of popular tropes inspired originally by Wagnerism. But I caution us against the optimism that there will be a narrative. I think our moment is, there's a lot of them, and they all are being constructed as mere narratives. Doesn't matter if they're grounded in anything or not. So I wondered if you could muse with us on this notion of how opinion is formed and who has control of what narratives.
Yeah, no disagreement, believe me, about the fragmentation, and I am scared sick about what's going on. QAnon is the most dangerous thing I've seen in this country in my lifetime. I was saying earlier today, I'm working on a book now where I've been reading about the rise of the Nazis, and one of the ways that they rose to power in the way that they did was delusional thinking.
Exactly.
And I also feel when I talk about myth, and I try to clarify this when I write, it's a very dangerous thing to be talking about, or certainly to be glorifying in any way, though I think we all, there's a term in history, myth history, where history, and this speaks to your point, where history, which traditionally we've said has been written by the winners, circulates values and beliefs and forms a way of thinking about truth. And that they call myth history. So there's a sort of mythic element to that. So I think when I talk about myth, I talk about the power of a particular narrative. I'm not willing to condemn it entirely because I think it's too fundamental, but myths are we should be attentive to our mythic thinking because it is very dangerous in all the ways you talk about. The one, I think, disagreement that I might have, or it's not really a strong disagreement, but the one thought, because I agree with all the things you said, I'm not sure any longer that we live in a world where there are so many ways of circulating stories. And I'm not sure that I'm not sure who the winner is in a short-term way. So I'm not sure, like Donald Trump being reelected, God forbid, is not going to shape the way history is taught. I don't believe. I think history will be taught very different ways in very different places in the fragmented way that you talk about, and people will believe things that they are taught to believe. And if you never leave your small town and there's a particular way of thinking about the world, and you're not doing a lot of reading, you're likely to think about the world in that way. But one of the things they're finding is the more people encounter people outside. So they found that areas around international airports tended to be bluer. And that's because international airports are in large cities, and large cities have lots of people from all over the place, and tourists and, immigrants and whatever. So the more we encounter each other, the more those small narratives get tested. And I guess ultimately I need to be hopeful about that. I mean, the fact is, Trump does not get educated people, and I'm not talking intelligent or not intelligent, educated. Who are educated people who have been exposed to different points of view. And those people are less likely to vote for Trump than people who haven't had that opportunity, let's say. So I guess I would agree with what you're saying, but I'm not convinced any longer that the ruler writes history, as Benjamin talks about. Is that okay? Did I respond?
I certainly hope you're right. I was taking the notion of history as an overarching question. I wasn't really assuming Donald Trump will write the narrative. What I'm saying is right now, talking about the we, how are we going to tell this tale? I think we have to look more carefully at how opinions are formed.
Yeah.
And as you say, how self-delusions are encouraged and used politically. I was just problematizing a tiny little bit, because what you've done tonight is really superb. But problematizing just a little bit that question of language and popular memes, and also asking us to consider there is a strong undercurrent here that goes back to social Darwinism. Just let them die.
Absolutely.
And what the counter to that might be.
Right.
So I was just trying to problematize it a little bit, not criticize. And
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Thank you.
And I do hope Trump is swept into the dustbin of history. I'm sorry I had to say that, but of course I agree.
I said to people, I used to censor myself, certainly when I gave a talk, and I can't anymore. So.
Thank you, Linda. That's great. Those questions also came up earlier for us during our seminar, and yeah, we didn't quite get deep enough, I think, in that discussion. Great. We have a couple of people signing off, and we basically were approaching the end of our time. So maybe one last question from Bethany, and then we'll wrap up.
And these have been great questions. Thank you. And great comments and corrections, and yeah, really helpful and terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. I'm glad that we can still have like these type of talks over Zoom. There's like something I've been thinking about lately, and you briefly like used the term like going back to normal. And I think that really irritates me, because it oddly sounds very similar to Make America Great Again, this kind of like going backwards to this past like idealized situation. And I also really hate it, because I think it is a very ignorant point of view. I think part of what you were saying is like, this calls for social changes, this is a call for other forms of action besides just medical advancements. And I think that term, using that term, really attests to that. Because when you use that, when you say, oh, we'll get back to normal soon, well, if everything will be back to how it was, it's a sense of ignorance. Like, no, well, this is a challenge, and we should rise to the occasion, and we should change how we're going to deal with this, so that in the future, we don't go through this again. Because the reason we're here is because the past wasn't that great. So the normal wasn't where we want to be. So I definitely see that in a lot of older generations. I don't think people my age necessarily say that a lot, which I also find really interesting. But I just kind of wanted to bring up those type of thoughts, and I don't know if you have any more things to contribute to that.
That was beautifully put. I think that's a great place to end that. Yes, 100%. Well said.
Yes, I mean, I put the quote into the chat because I think it's a great one. The normal wasn't what it needed to be, or what it needs to be. Okay, well, excellent. Thank you so much, all the participants. It was a great discussion. I want to thank you again, Professor Wald, for bringing your expertise to our campus, and it's a great start to our year of programming.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here and these fantastic questions and comments. So thank you.